we'll be talking about the disputed territory of Namibia. Namibia, commonly referred to as Southwest Africa by the South Africans, is neither a colony nor a country. It exists in limbo as an international territory illegally occupied by South Africa. The legal position of Namibia was resolved in July of 1971 before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The ICJ ruled at that time that South Africa's administration of Namibia was illegal and that it was obliged to withdraw from the territory. This ruling was accepted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. However, the South African government has persistently violated the UN call to withdraw from Namibia and has illegally appointed an Administrator General. The UN Assembly has recognized the Southwest Africa Peoples Organization, or SWAPO, as the sole authentic representative of the peoples of Namibia. Since 1977, a contact group of 5 Western members of the United Nations Security Council have been negotiating with representatives of SWAPO, the South African government, and the frontline states. However, for the present, power continues to reside with South Africa in a constituent assembly elected in 1978. In today's Black Horizons program, this will be the first of a 3-part series dealing with the Namibian situation. In today's program, we will examine Namibia and its peoples, discuss a brief chronology of the developments of the country up to the ICJ decision in 1971, and examine what social conditions are like for Namibians today. I have joining me as my guest Celestine Bassey of the Political Science Department at Dalhousie and a resident of Calabar, Nigeria. Brother Celestine, welcome to the Black Horizons program.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if, to begin our program, if you could locate for us Namibia, or Southwest Africa as it's commonly referred to by the South Africans, within the context of the continent of Africa, and tell us something about the territory and its peoples.
Oh, I see. Well, if we may have just a brief look at the map here on the wall, you can see this is the continent of Africa, and Namibia is located southwest of the continent of Africa. And it was a former German colony until the end of the First World War, and as a part of the sharing of the German booty after the First World War by the Victoria Allies, the territory that we now call Namibia passed on to the government of South Africa at the time as a mandate by the League of Nations of that period. And until, well, since South Africa was granted mandate of the territory, since the end of First World War, the issue of Namibia had been very much highlighted by the successor organization, that is the United Nations, and until this very moment, it is still, from the South African point of view, a de facto territory under the South African control.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about the country itself, the peoples of the country, where they are settled in the country, and how the territory is divided up among the various peoples and so on?
I see. Well, South Africa, actually, I mean, right from the time it took over control of Southwest Africa, that territory that we now call Namibia, well, from the terms of the resolution actually granting South Africa mandate anyway, South Africa was supposed to be the caretaker, I mean, like an orphan being given to a guardian, and to promote both the social, economic, and the politics of, and bring the people eventually to independence anyway. But it was quite clear right from the beginning that South Africa was moving towards making the present territory that we call Namibia presently a 5th province of South Africa. And to that extent, since South Africa took control of the territory, it has introduced its Bantustan program into the territory of Namibia. Now, the Bantustan program is just a replica of what is presently happening in South Africa, in which the territory itself, in terms of population, you have about 10% white in the population and 90% Africans. But in order to, in order to gain proper control of the territory through the usual policy that we call divide and rule policy, South Africa went on to balkanize the whole territory into 9 reserves anyway, and these reserves are what we actually refer to as the Bantustans. Now, these reserves only take over settle only on the 40% of the total area of Namibia, of what we call the Southwest African Territory. And South Africa and the minority white regime in the territory has control of the 60% of the territory, and also has control of all the resources and the arable land. So what, in fact, we are really seeing there is a sort of situation of domestic colonialism, whereby the Africans themselves are balkanized, so-called along tribal lines, but at the same time isolated from each other. And this, to a certain extent, will enable South Africa to maintain its grip on the population, and also to gain its economic policy anyway of using the Africans as cheap laborers anyway to the mines, and also to maintain a general policy of perpetuated rule anyway under the minority regime in South Africa. So I mean, this is the whole strategy of the neo-colonialist policy in Southwest Africa that we generally refer to as the Bantustan program that South Africa has presently implemented in that country.
What can you tell us about the resources of the territory of Namibia? Is it a poor area? Is it wealthy in resources? What can you tell us about the resources there?
Well, a visitor to Namibia today, seeing the vast desert, the Kalahari and the Namib Desert, would think, what are people really doing in this area? But now it is quite clear that this apparently desert waste anyway of a territory is really one of the potentially richest area on the entire continent of Africa. Presently, the resource potential includes uranium. It also includes diamond and also gold and cobalt. And also, there had been a lot of speculation that the territory is also rich in other mineral resources anyway that are yet to be mapped and located and mapped anyway. But it is the general consensus anyway, both of the international and national community, that it's a country that is potentially rich in resources.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, for the person, the layman who may not be that familiar with all of the intricacies of the debate, and for that matter may not even be familiar as to where Namibia is geographically located, in a nutshell, could you sort of explain or describe the general nature of the dispute over Namibia?
Yeah, well, primarily the dispute over Namibia is part and parcel of the colonial legacy of entire African continent. Well, as earlier mentioned, South Africa was granted mandate over the whole territory of Namibia after the First World War. In fact, it was the intention of this government of General Smith to annex Namibia as a fifth province of South Africa. But he was prevented from doing this by the phrase of peace without annexation that actually came out under the 14 points of President Woodrow Wilson. So to that extent anyway, since South Africa could not annex this territory after the First World War, it was simply granted mandate over the territory. And mandate implies temporary administration of the area until the time that the international organization that granted South Africa, that was the first, the League of Nations, and its successor, the United Nations, found it necessary for legal independence to be granted to the territory. Now, after the Second World War, particularly from 1950, the states of Africa, especially especially Liberia and Ethiopia, did bring a bill towards the United Nations Assembly that South Africa should eventually grant independence to Namibia. Now, South Africa disputed this bill, but later on, the Assembly did rule after 1960, after a very long legal battle at the World Court of The Hague, 1966, which of course was not really, in terms of being a clear-cut statement of intent by the United Nations to grant independence to Southwest Africa. But after that, there was a resolution 2145 passed in 1966, to which the United States, for instance, was a signatory, that South Africa should prepare to grant independence to the territory. But South Africa, for its own strategic, economic, and political reasons, has totally, since 1966 and since the ruling of 71, also completely disregarded the resolution of the United Nations, the concern of the international community, that independence should be granted to Namibia. Well, after the failures of the international community, and especially also the people of Namibia, to win independence through a peaceful effort, SWAPO, which is now presently recognized as the legitimate representative of the Namibian people, it launched its military plan right from 1966 that we now called, the SWAPO guerrillas, now operating from Angola to liberate the territory by force anyway. So then, the nature of the dispute is presently a matter of South Africa versus the international community, especially those who are members of the United Nations, over the granting of independence to Namibia and the withdrawal of South Africa from the territory that it has occupied illegally, especially after 1950, and with the court resolution also of 1966.
I think that's the essence of it. When you look at the 1971 decision, where it was very clearly indicated that the continued occupation of Namibia by South Africa was illegal, and they've basically just ignored the international community. They have no recognition by any members of the international community. They've just continued to occupy the territory illegally.
Yeah.
I wonder if perhaps you could go back to that decision in 1971 before the International Court of Justice and just explain a bit about what actually took place there, what was the position that was put forward perhaps by the international community on behalf of the people of Namibia, and the counterposition that was put forward by the South Africans, and what action was taken or wasn't taken, I guess might be a better way of saying it, by the South Africans after the decision.
Well, the decision of the International Court of Justice of 1971 has to be seen within the general context of a battle that actually started from 1960. Now, in 1960, both Ethiopia and Liberia brought a bill before the United Nations General Assembly, granting, asking that, the continued presence of South Africa in Namibia should be declared illegal. Now, well, because of some established interest anyway within the United Nations, especially those of Western powers like Britain and France anyway, because of the obvious economic involvement in Namibia, the issue was transferred from the United Nations Assembly to the World Court at The Hague. Now, the first judgment came in 1966, in which I would be, it's unfortunate to say that the judges at the World Court of The Hague were split along racial line. So nothing in terms of definitive judgment actually came out of the Supreme Court in the International Court of Justice in 1966. Now, it was then, after the procrastination of the International Court of The Hague in 1966, that the United Nations Assembly took matters into its hand and passed the resolution 2415, which established that the South African presence in Namibia from then on was totally legal. So, in other words, the legal administration of the territory by South Africa was converted into an illegal occupation right from 1966, and the resolution definitely asked South Africa to withdraw its presence from Namibia from 1966. Now, between 1966 and 1971, in spite of the resolution, and countries like the United States did back the resolution in 1966, But later on, it became very evident anyway, especially to the Afro-Asian members of the United Nations, that though this bill had been passed, and right from then on questioned both by Britain and France, that although the United States has given its own blessing at the passing of the bill, that the United States was also joining the forces of Britain and France to question this resolution. So the members of the General Assembly, especially the Afro-Asian blood, who were very, very much offended and had gone on taken a sort of militant approach to the issue now, demanded that something has to be done forcefully, if need be, to get South Africa to withdraw. Then the issue has to go again to the International Court at The Hague in 1971, and there the International Court at The Hague maintained that the resolution of 1966 was valid and reaffirmed the decision by the Assembly that South Africa has to withdraw from the territory and granted its legal independence. So it was that resolution which reaffirmed and then forestalled the sort of dragging anyway that had actually arisen anyway among the Western members of the General Assembly and the United Nations. But the decision of 1971 helped to clarify whatever doubts anyway that some of the countries might have had about the resolution of 1966 by giving its own legitimacy in terms of international law and also within the rights of the United Nations.
So then it appears that the very same issue that was discussed in '66 but not dealt with conclusively by the court was the very same issue that was brought back in 1971.
Precisely.
So there was more or less, there was a 5 or 6 year period there where people, even though a decision had been made, were more or less refusing to acknowledge it. Not only South Africa, but as you mentioned, France and Britain as well were questioning it.
Precisely. As I indicated, in 1966, the decision itself by the World Court at The Hague was not decisive. It was not definitive anyway. And as I said, the judges there were split along racial lines, with the white judges supporting South Africa and the non-white judges anyway against South Africa. But again, as I said also, that the United Nations General Assembly did after that take matters into their hand, and then they passed a resolution. This resolution and the indecisiveness of the International Court, the embarrassment that the indecisiveness actually caused, did compel the court about 4 to 5 years later to reverse its decision. And this was why in 1971 the court actually held to the contents of the resolution that the United Nations is right to ask South Africa to withdraw to end its illegal occupation of the country. And that was the pivotal point, anyway, the cardinal point of the resolution.
Now, what action was taken then on the part of the United Nations after this decision in 1971 to give effect to this decision of the International Court? Is this where Resolution 385 came in?
Well, I think this had always been not only the embarrassing, anyway, the frustrating aspect of international organizations such as the United Nations. What we see the United Nations, though, we feel that when its members actually pass a resolution, that they will go on to implement the resolution. But you'll always find that there are always some vested members, anyway, with vested interest, anyway, who may literally be dragged along, anyway, in terms of resolution, but they will do everything, anyway, to prevent its implementation. So what actually happened after '71 is, on the one hand, is the intransigence of South Africa itself, is complete disregard for the decision of the World Court at The Hague, and also is complete disregard anyway for the resolution of the United Nations. Now, after '71 then, I mean, the Afro-Asian members did ask that if South Africa doesn't withdraw, South Africa should be given a deadline. And after that, the United Nations, the international community should take a definitive action to enforce the withdrawal of the United Nations. But this is where both the United States, France, and Great Britain, had their triple veto in 1974, to sort of forestall any attempt, anyway, to commit the United Nations, into compelling the South African government to withdraw its illegal administration of the territory. So we have two things here, the intransigence of the South African government itself. On the other hand, this indirect and direct support, anyway, it has received from Western powers such as the United States, France, and Great Britain, in terms of using its veto power to frustrate any sort of definitive action on the part of the United Nations community to compel South Africa to withdraw from the territory.
Well, we want to come back in our second program in this series and look a bit at some of the intrigue that's taken place around the UN resolutions and court decisions and so on, which have allowed the illegal, and I think we have to stress that time and time again, the illegal occupation of Namibia by South Africa. But I'd like to just turn from that for a moment and look at the conditions, the social conditions, other conditions for the average citizen of Namibia. What can you tell us about what conditions are like in Namibia?
Well, this is where the question of the Bantustan program or system that is implemented in South Africa and also has been duplicated in Namibia when the Odendel Plan of 1974 came into effect anyway. This plan provides for the entire balkanization, that is the territorial separation of the races. Namibia is made of whites, what we call the coloreds, and the Africans. Now the whites only constitute about 10% of the population, is just about 100,000 by the current census figure. And then the Africans make up the 90% of the population. But yet when it comes to the total territorial area, the whites have taken over 60% of the land, and this 60% of the land includes the best arable land, that is where farming is possible in Namibia. You know, you don't have to forget that at least the good proportion of Namibia itself is made of desert. On the one hand is the Nama Desert, and the other one is the Kalahari Desert. So the best part of arable land has gone to the minority, the dominant minority of the population. And also this land also contains all the mineral resources anyway of the country. Now by excluding non-whites from this zone, what they call the rich zone, and putting them into sort of reserves. So by right, they are not legally or politically entitled to any benefits from these resources anyway, because they are defined as something belonging to the white areas. Now then the blacks are put into the reserves, so the only way they can earn their living, because I mean these reserves have no economic base, and it's located in the desert region. I mean, looking at the map, it's located at the desert region of the desert region of
let's just give the camera crew a chance to get focused in on this. Have you got it? Okay, now perhaps you could.
So you can see that Africans, non-whites, are balkanized, I mean separated into so-called tribal groups, and there are about 9 of them altogether, and they are located in areas outside what might call the rich zone, which is this area. The rich zone is the white area.
Right.
Now the various reserves are located in the Kalahari area and also the Namib area of Namibia. Now it simply means by definition that the non-whites in Namibia are not legally entitled to benefit from the resources. They could only benefit from it to the extent to which they sell themselves as cheap laborers to the mines, and also as servants anyway to the cities of Namibia. So the situation there has actually caused a lot of imbalance anyway in terms of the earnings of the racial groupings. I mean, I can just give one example. In the mines, for instance, a black presently earns about the equivalent of 199 South African rand in a year, whereas a white also involved in such a job earns about 4,000 rands anyway doing that particular type of job. Now the rationale, as I've said, is that, well, because of the definition of who has who in Namibia and where you are in Namibia, and that blacks are not legally citizens of Namibia. You know, they're only citizens of what we call the reserves, the Bantustans. So whenever they appear in the rich zone, they only appear as laborers anyway. They are almost foreigners to the region. The subsequent concessions made by the so-called Tonghel Alliance do not differ from these facts. This happens to be the realities of the situation in South Africa today, where one's livelihood, one's earning and one's life chances anyway is defined by its own pigmentation. So you have three categories of people: the dominant minority, the whites, having the standard of living, which is compared to other areas of the world is very astronomical. Then comes what we call the coloreds anyway, that's the hybrids, the mulatto. Then the majority of the population, the Africans, are right at the bottom of the scale. And the fact that under the so-called Tonghel Alliance, blacks who participated in this so-called multiracial party have no veto power whatsoever. They have up till now been unable to abolish this migrant system of labor, because the white members of the party always cast their veto. They have the veto, and up till now they've been clearly unable anyway to bring about some integrated social services anyway. And the dominant group they've repeatedly stated that they either close such facilities anyway rather than make it multiracial on the basis. So then,
So apartheid
the imbalances anyway is just a situation of apartheid, and this was introduced himself by South Africans into Namibia. But I have also to stress that what we really call the apartheid or the Bantustan system, especially the one in Namibia today, was actually taken over by the South Africans from the Germans. The Germans had what they call the red zone or the red line defining areas fit for white settlement, and the police zone for the Africans anyway. So these reserves and the imbalances were created by the Germans. Already they have actually set the foundation, and these were documented by the South African in what we call the Blue Book. But when the South Africans took over, instead of improving on it, they rather built on it. It's just like what is happening in South Africa today. The reserves were created by the British before 1910, and the present South African government simply built on the foundation created by Britain in South Africa itself. So as I earlier mentioned, it's just a matter of colonial legacy and the perpetuation of colonial inequalities both in Namibia and South Africa.
In the 1 minute or so we have left, the effect of this is that if you happen to be an African in Namibia, and you're outside of your the reserve land, you're in one of these areas. The minute that you cease to have a job, as I understand it, you become a felon.
Precisely, and this is where the pass laws, the passbook comes into effect anyway. Every African has to carry a sort of identity card on him, and this identity card is meant to for influx control, that is controlling the number of blacks coming from their so-called homeland to the urban areas anyway that are by definition white areas. So immediately you are there in that area, you don't have your passbook anyway, you can be arrested and imprisoned without trial. And also, if, for instance, you happen to lose your job, you have to get back to the reserve. So it has to do with influx control, and also the passbook has to do with keeping blacks at certain jobs, menial jobs, in South Africa itself and in Namibia itself. So, the whole crickery and legal system is constructed on this basis, and this is generally what we refer to as apartheid, which is also in operation in Namibia itself.
Well, we've just cracked the surface on this very important discussion. We'll want to invite you back next week when we'll continue with our part 2 and look, as I said earlier, at some of the intrigue that has taken place, which has prevented the independence of Namibia. We want to thank you for watching our program today. Join us next week, won't you?
When we heed a certain call, when the world must come together as one, there are people dying. pretending day by day that someone somewhere will soon make a change. We all a part of God's great.
Today we have our second part in our three-part series dealing with Namibia, the disputed territory. In today's program, we will discuss the principal parties in the Namibian dispute and the factors which have delayed Namibian independence. I have joining me on the program Celestine Bassey of the Political Science Department at Dalhousie and a resident of Calabar, Nigeria. Brother Celestine, welcome back for this second program in our series on Namibia.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if perhaps we could take a few minutes at the beginning of today's program just to go back and summarize the main points that we talked about in our first program in the series for those of our viewers who perhaps may not have seen our first program.
I see. Well, I think the first program was a preliminary in nature. We talked about the political geography of Namibia, and we also talked about the conditions of the people there in Namibia, the location of Namibia, the political geography, the condition of the people, as I said, and then the general question about the dispute, the present dispute, we are presently concerned, and which the United Nations is concerned about. That's the dispute involving South African illegal occupation in Namibia. So what we actually did in the first program, it was in every nature preliminary, so about those background questions, which we hope to develop upon today.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if perhaps you could give us a brief chronology of the development of Namibia over the years leading up to the International Court of Justice decision in 1971. We discussed that decision last week, but could you give us a little bit of the background of the development of Namibia? It has passed through the various stages as a mandated territory and as a possession of the Germans and so on?
Yeah, well, I did indicate in the first program that what the country that we now call Namibia is the country that was known as Southwest African Territory, and that until the end of the Second World War, it was a German colony. And after the end of this, until the end of the First World War, it was a German colony. And after the end of the First World War, it passed on to the mandate of South Africa. So this was parcel of the League of Nations attempt, to create conditions towards eventual independence of the territory. We saw that it wasn't only South Africa that was granted mandate over territories. There were other German colonies. Now we have Lebanon and Syria, for instance, that was given to France, and Britain to Palestine. But after the Second World War, these territories, the former mandated territories, were granted independence. Britain did that to Palestine, France did that to Syria and France, but South Africa has since tenaciously and illegally held its presence in Namibia. After the Second World War, that is after 1945, South Africa requested the Present General Assembly of the United Nations that it should be allowed to annex Namibia. While the Assembly declined and saw such move as illegal, and on the part of South Africa refused to recognize the present territory of the present Assembly of the United Nations as a legitimate successor to the defunct League of Nations. But pressure was brought to bear on South Africa, and we also saw that between 1960 and 66, there was an ongoing battle in the International Court at The Hague, and this followed a bill brought by Ethiopia and Liberia to declare South Africa's continuous presence in Namibia illegal. And after, by 1966, the time of the first ruling, we saw that the decision from the International Court at The Hague was indecisive, and that the judges, unfortunately, at the World Court at The Hague, were split along racial lines, with the white judges indirectly supporting South Africa and the non-white judges in favor of the people of Namibia and in favor of the Afro-Asian bloc within the United Nations to declare South African presence illegal. But after the debacle of 1966 involving the International Court of Justice, and the embarrassment that it caused subsequently, that the United Nations General Assembly took matters into its hand and passed Resolution 2145, declaring continued South African presence in Namibia illegal, therefore turning legal entitlement of South Africa to administer the territory into an illegal occupation. This was after 1966 with Resolution 2145. But we also saw that there were some important and crucial members of the General Assembly, like Great Britain and France, who refused to support the resolution because of their legitimate economic interest in Namibia. Well, like today, we shall see that the main company, the Lonro Company, that is presently involved in the exploitation of the resources of Namibia is a British company, and that the former chairman of this company is presently the British foreign minister, the present British foreign minister. So because of that, by 1971, since the question was indecisive in spite of this resolution, the issue went again to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. But this time, after the embarrassment that was caused by the indecisiveness of 1966, that the International Court at The Hague unanimously held that South Africa's presence in Namibia after 1966 was illegal, and also advised South Africa to withdraw from the territory in accordance to Resolution 2145 of the United Nations. But we know that since 1971, that South Africa has still held tenaciously to the territory. I suppose today we shall try in our program to see why South Africa's presence and why South Africa's continuous presence had been allowed to continue, especially from the point of view of the United Nations until this moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we get into the explanation of how South Africa has been able to continue its illegal occupation of Namibia, I wonder if perhaps you would just take a few minutes to clarify the various parties that are involved in this dispute, and perhaps tell us something about the interest of the groups. I'm thinking about SWAPO, for example, and the Turnhill Alliance, and the South African government, and the United Nations, and so on. Can you just give us a bit of an overview of who the parties in the dispute are and what their interests are?
Well, the parties to this dispute could be divided into what might call the primary actors and the secondary actors.
Right.
Now, the primary actors in this case, as far as Namibia is concerned, we'll call South Africa first, who is very much interested in perpetuating its presence in Namibia for strategic, economic, and political reasons. And then the other actor is SWAPO itself. SWAPO, that's the Southwest African People Organization that is now in the vanguard of the opposition, both militarily and diplomatically, of South African presence in Namibia, and it has been accorded the status of the only legitimate representative of the Namibian people, and it has a seat in the United Nations to meet this official status. The other parties to the dispute that we might describe, first of all, as primary, but to a certain extent secondary, is the Western powers themselves. South Africa has been able to defy the opinion of the international community so far because of the tacit support it has received from the Western powers. Now, anybody who studies the voting pattern in the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council since 1945 will see that until the period of 1974-75, that's from 1945, that's the end of the Second World War, to the period in the early 70s, that countries like Britain, United States, France have either voted in favor of South Africa on basic issues.
What about Canada? Has Canada been part of that group?
Well, Canada had been a part of the group, but Canada's position here had not been very conspicuous because Canada hasn't got a veto power. The position of other members like Britain, France, and the United States had been so conspicuous because they have the veto power in the United Nations. So even at a time when overwhelmingly, like recently, there's a resolution is passed which may lead to the condemnation of South Africa, while countries, like United States, Britain, and France with the veto power will be able to veto it. But Canada had so far been in the background while actually being within the orbit, the caucus and the voting bloc of the Western powers. But since Canada hasn't got this veto power, it hasn't been as conspicuous as the other countries, as United States, Britain, France. So we've seen that if you study the pattern of the voting of these countries in the United Nations since 1945, that they've either voted in support of South Africa. But by the late 60s, when such position became more and more embarrassing, especially with the militant action of the Afro-Asian members, meant these countries would either be neutral or they would either come out openly, like in the early 70s, to veto certain resolutions that they feel is not to their interest, interest defined in economic and political terms, especially as far as the Southern African region is concerned. But again, I've shown that this period actually came to some sort of an end, after the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, because even until the early 70s, it has been a common belief here in the West that what might call white Africa, that's the section of Africa that had been dominated by the white regime, could withstand any sort of onslaught, that they have the organizational and the military capacity. And we have also seen that the National Security Memorandum written by Henry Kissinger under Nixon openly advocated that the Americans should throw in their lots in support of the white regimes of Southern Africa, that because by the year 2000, that those areas will still be under the control of the white minority of the area. But the event took a turn in the mid-70s with the collapse of the Portuguese Empire and the escalation of war in Namibia. So it was at this time that this complacency, this arrogance on the part of the Western power came to an abrupt end, and there started a period of paranoia and a period in which these countries know that if they continue their present policy, that events may always take things out of their hand. We've seen this in Angola, Mozambique, and also Zimbabwe. So this from 1975, and with the initiation of the Carter administration, we saw a sort of new area in the initiative of the Western powers, which unfortunately is coming to an end now with another administration in the United States presently.
Okay. Well, I wonder then if you could tell us a bit about the various plans that have been put forward by the United Nations since the International Court of Justice decision in 1971 to provide for the independence of Namibia, to get the South Africans who have been occupying the country illegally out of the country. And sort of a related question to that, I guess a second part of that, what in your opinion have been the principal factors which have delayed Namibian independence? Because, as we know, South Africa still continues illegally to occupy South Africa. First of all, could you tell us something about the various kinds of initiatives that have been taken by the United Nations to secure the independence, and then perhaps give us some explanation as to why they have been unsuccessful?
Well, as far as the initiative of the United Nations is concerned, until between 1971 and 75, it will be wrong to talk in terms of initiative, because at this particular time, again, what we call the oligarchy of the Gang of Five in the United Nations had always operated under the belief that while the situation in Southern Africa doesn't warrant such move to push South Africa into a corner. Remember, until 1976, that Angola had not been independent, and Mozambique had not been independent, and Zimbabwe had not been independent.
Yes.
So between 1971 and 75, the Western powers especially did not see any cause for alarm about hurrying, the independence of Namibia. But this abruptly came to an end with the independence, the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, and the appearance of the Cubans as a force in Angola to counter the involvement of South Africa in Angola, which we now know with the publications of books like the former CIA operative, that is Stockwell, that involvement of South Africa in Angola was instigated by the United States, and the cover for it also was given by the United States. But after 1975, with the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, many of the Western countries and Western government became very alarmed that if events are allowed to proceed in Namibia at such a snail pace as it usually, that eventually they may end up with a government in Namibia that will not be very much amenable to the to Western economic and strategic interests. So it was then, coinciding with Carter's appearance in the White House, a new initiative was put into operation on the part of United States and other Western powers. Now, this initiative was to organize a general election in Namibia itself, supervised by United Nations and predicated upon the withdrawal of South African forces. Now, here was the crux of the question. South Africa initially rejected anything having to do with the United Nations supervision for this very reason that the South Africans were quite aware of the fact that if, as in Zimbabwe, that any one man, one vote is allowed in Namibia, the SWAPO will certainly win the election.
Yes.
We saw what happened in Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe, and the South Africans were very much aware of that. And also they completely stalled on the question of the withdrawal of South African forces out of Namibia, and they wanted the Walvis Bay, which is the only natural harbor of Namibia, to be made part and parcel of South Africa, even with the independence of Namibia. So there were certain outstanding disputes, but under Carter administration, with Carter's persuasion of his NATO allies, a coherent plan was put into effect. And this, as I said, involved a general election. But South Africa completely stalled on that particular question. And we've seen cases of the visit to South Africa by Western representatives to urge South Africa towards acceptance of the particularly Anglo-American plan, within the context of the United Nations of general election. But we've seen that since then, South Africa has either stalled on one question on the other until the departure of Carter from the White House and the appearance of Ronald Reagan. And we've seen that with President Reagan in the White House, South Africa has gone back totally on the promises that it made. And while this had always been the nature of the dispute in Namibia, that any U.S. government that gets itself off the back of the South Africans, South Africa will go back to its initial policy of perpetuating its interest and also its presence in Namibia. That any government like that of former President Jimmy Carter that sees Namibia, for instance, as a potential explosive question in Southern Africa, South Africa will hurry to a certain extent to follow the United Nations policy. But as a whole, we've seen actually that now with the new U.S. government in the United States, there's hardly anything we can expect from the present plan that had been suggested by the United Nations General Assembly towards a gradual independence for Namibia.
We want to talk in our next program, in part 3 of this series, about American foreign policy at the moment on Namibia. I think you've touched on a very important point here, the key role that pressure, particularly pressure from Western groups, can have in terms of bringing about satisfactory resolution of the Namibian situation. It may not be the only thing, but certainly it's a very important area. Which brings us back to this, I think, this group of 5, the Gang of 5, I think they're affectionately referred to in the halls of the United Nations. That is Britain, France, United States, West Germany, and Canada, who are the contact group, the group of 5 who have been attempting to get South Africa to take various actions over the years. It's been argued that this particular group, and I think we've touched on this a little bit in the beginning of today's program, it's been argued that this group has very strong vested interests, very strong economic interests in Namibia, and with the continued illegal occupation of Namibia by South Africa. How would you respond to that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Well, Namibia itself has to be seen within the general context of Southern Africa. It's a region rich in resources, especially strategic mineral resources. And now we know about the uranium in Namibia, and we know about other resources that are of vital interest to the Western industries. So, I mean, but the interest of the Western powers in Namibia is not just economic, it's also strategic. Yes. You take the Walvis Bay, for instance, it commands entrance to the whole Southern African zone of operation. I mean, if you just turn the map of the world upside down, then you can see what part of the world, the central strategic position of Southern Africa means to Western NATO blocs in terms of their deployment in Indian Ocean, and also in terms of the sea route. There's the sea line of communication around the Cape of Good Hope. Presently, West Germany under NATO has a very sophisticated surveillance system in Walvis Bay. It was installed there by the state company of West Germany, and they have one of these also in Simpsontown in South Africa itself. So it's not just a question of economic interest, which is
Yes.
of vital importance. Now, I mean, this is the whole, this is the whole part and parcel of the crisis in capitalism, that any country that depends so much as the Western countries, does the export-oriented countries, will have to keep a sure guide that, you know, its source of raw materials and also market are always safe. I mean, this explains the current American paranoia about Soviet involvement in the Middle East. It's also the same thing with Southern African region, because many of the strategic minerals which had been used and which the West formerly had resources for, you can only count on the Soviet Union now and the Southern African country to provide those strategic minerals, and Namibia happens to be one of them. So the Western countries in particular do have very strong and vested economic interests. And I did mention that the resources of Southern Africa is exploited by the Western company, especially that of Namibia, the Lonro company. But again, I think I should say here that much of this paranoia on the part of Western government is very much misplaced. That the very fact that there is a Marxist government in any of the African countries doesn't of necessity means that, you know, their access to these strategic economic resources had been cut off. I mean, you take Angola as a classical example. In spite of the obstacles that the United States has created about the recognition of Angola, its participation in the United Nations, that the resources of Angola presently is exploited by American company. The American oil company drills the oil of Angola, and much of the business, you know, of Angolan government with Western countries is with the United States. And this is why a number of business men involved in the business community in the Western world have actually pointed to the archaic nature of American continuation, and not to accord any diplomatic recognition to Angola, because they only see that the so-called ideological barrier created by the Marxist government in Angola is only there in name, that in terms of real economic trade and resource exploitation, that even this government had been far more amenable to Western policies in that area than originally foreseen. So as I said, the West do have a very strong vested interest in Namibia, but it doesn't mean that this interest would be jeopardized, because these countries depend on these resources for their international balance of trade, and also depend on it for their foreign exchange. So they will still continue to sell their resources to whoever wants to buy it on the current international market. So as far as that point is concerned, that much of the Western concern about socialist or Marxist government in certain parts of the world, including Southern Africa, is very much misplaced. And finally, I do also believe in the right of the people to choose the sort of government they want. If they want a socialist government, it's the right of the people of Namibia to have a socialist government. Their sort of government and socioeconomic policies should not be determined for them by any country or any group of country because of their economic involvement in that region. So I think this is wrong, and this is what the Western power is yet to learn, as they're presently learning about Arab nationalism. They are to learn about black nationalism in Africa, that a time has come that they know that the people have the right to determine what their own future is and what their own economic and ideological orientation should be, and should not be determined by them, by the former imperial powers. I think this point has to be taken serious cognizance of, if blunders like Vietnam, and also if blunders like Iran has to be avoided, and also Angola and Zimbabwe.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the 5 or so minutes that we have left remaining in today's program, as we've said many times already in today's program, South Africa has continued to illegally occupy Namibia since, well, certainly since 1971. Could you tell us a bit about how they've structured the political system of Namibia in order to be able to affect the control? Who's in charge of Namibia at the moment, and what is the domestic political situation like, for example? We touched a little bit on this last week when we talked about the Turnhill DTA party and so on. What can you tell us about the way in which South Africa has ruled this country legally since 1971?
Well, especially since 1976, because this was where both the United Nations as a community and Western powers really made serious initiative towards an independence for Namibia. But South Africa on its part has moved towards what we call internal settlement. That is type of strategy and tactics that Ian Smith actually tried in Zimbabwe. What we really call the Democratic Thornhill Alliance, though it has been given coverage in the Western press as a multiracial party, this is very, very misleading. While in the Thornhill Alliance, all the white members of the party participate as individuals, but blacks do not participate in this party, the DTA, the Democratic Thornhill Alliance, as individuals. They only participate, that's the black members of the party, as appointed members of what they call the so-called homelands, thus the chiefs, and as Africans refer to them, the drunken illiterates, that the South African representatives themselves have elected to join in this party. And again, I did mention that these chiefs do not have any sort of veto power. This elected representative of the black people of the various homelands do not have any veto power. It has been indicated in '78 when they tried to move towards a better economic policy for the blacks, that it was effectively vetoed by the white members of the organization. And also when they also tried to bring about integration of the school system, it was vetoed. So what we really call this multiracial party, the Thornhill Alliance, this South Africa itself has engineered and established as a puppet government, which will be amenable to South Africa itself. It's only multiracial in name. And on the other hand, it has allowed South Africa to continue its vicious presence in Namibia, in that it has given the control of defense, of foreign policy, and also it has defined the parameters of legislative powers given to the Thornhill Alliance. So this party really exists as a puppet of South Africa, and it has no bearing, in fact, as a separate independent party which could bring the entire country and all its different racial groups to legitimate independence. So I think as far as this is concerned, the Western press has totally misinformed the Western community of the nature of this party.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that for today. I want to invite you back next week when we'll continue with part 3 of Namibia, Disputed Territory. At that time, we'll talk a bit about the significance of the excursion into Angola, the role of U.S. foreign policy on the settlement of the Namibian dispute, and hope to clarify some of the common myths about Namibia. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
There comes a time when we heed a certain call, when the world must come together